A kind black boy named Corey finds a lost wallet on the street and returns it to its owner, an old man named Mr. Abbott. But the next day, Corey is shocked when the police show up at his door. What could be the reason behind this unexpected visit? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Corey Williams wiped the sweat from his brow as he trudged home from basketball practice. The afternoon sun beat down on the cracked sidewalk, casting long shadows across the modest houses of his neighborhood. His sneakers, worn but well-loved, scuffed against the concrete with each step. As he walked, Corey's mind wandered to his family's struggles. His dad had lost his job months ago, and money had been tight ever since. The thought made Corey's heart heavy, but he tried to stay positive. That's just who he was, always looking for the silver lining. Maybe Dad will find a new job soon, Corey whispered to himself, clutching his basketball a little tighter. The park came into view, its rusty swings creaking in the gentle breeze. Corey loved this park. It was where he'd learned to ride a bike, where he'd had his first picnic, where he'd made some of his best friends. As he neared the entrance, something on the ground caught his eye. Corey slowed his pace, squinting at the object. It was small, brown, and leather. His heart skipped a beat as he realized what it was. A wallet. Glancing around, Corey saw no one nearby. The park was empty, save for a few birds pecking at the grass. He hesitated, unsure of what to do. His mom had always taught him not to touch things that didn't belong to him, but leaving the wallet there didn't feel right either. Taking a deep breath, Corey made his decision. He bent down and carefully picked up the wallet, holding it gingerly as if it might break. It felt heavy in his hands, and he could see the outline of cards and what looked like cash inside. Wow, Corey breathed, his eyes wide. He knew that whoever had lost this wallet must be really worried. He thought about how his own family would feel if they lost their money right now. The very idea made his stomach twist with anxiety. Corey looked around once more, hoping to see someone searching for their lost belongings. But the park remained quiet and still. He bit his lip, wondering what to do next. Should he open it to see if there was any identification inside? Should he take it to the police station? Or should he just leave it where he found it? As these questions swirled in his mind, Corey felt the weight of responsibility on his young shoulders. He knew that whatever he decided to do next would be important. It was moments like these that truly tested a person's character, and Corey was determined to do the right thing. Corey's fingers trembled as he carefully opened the wallet. His heart raced, a mix of curiosity and nervousness flooding through him. As he peered inside, he was surprised to find no money at all. Instead, there was a folded piece of paper and an old photograph tucked into one of the pockets. Gently, Corey pulled out the photograph. It showed a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, her hair styled in an old-fashioned way. The colors were faded, giving the picture a nostalgic feel. Corey couldn't help but wonder who she was and why her photo was in this wallet. Next, he noticed an ID card. The name on it read Harold Abbott, and the address listed was just a few blocks away. The picture showed an elderly man with wispy white hair and wrinkles that crinkled around his eyes when he smiled. Mr. Abbott must be really worried about his wallet, Corey thought, his brow furrowing with concern. For a moment, a small voice in the back of Corey's mind whispered that he could keep the wallet. After all, there wasn't any money in it, and his family could really use something nice right now. Maybe he could sell it or trade it for something they needed. But as quickly as the thought came, Corey felt ashamed. He remembered his mom's words. Honesty is always the best policy, sweetie, even when it's hard. Corey took a deep breath and made his decision. He knew what he had to do. It wasn't just about the wallet anymore. It was about doing what was right, even when no one was watching. "I've got to return this to Mr. Abbott," Corey said aloud, his voice firm with determination. "It's the right thing to do." With gentle hands, Corey carefully tucked the photo and the folded letter back into the wallet. He couldn't shake the feeling that these items were probably very important to Mr. Abbott. Maybe they held special memories or carried sentimental value. As Corey started walking towards the address on the ID, he felt a mix of emotions. He was nervous about meeting a stranger, but also proud of himself for choosing to do the right thing. He hoped Mr. Abbott would be home and that returning the wallet would bring a smile to the old man's face. Corey's heart pounded as he stood in front of Mr. Abbott's house. The small, single-story home looked a bit run down, with peeling paint and overgrown bushes, but the lawn was neatly trimmed and colorful flowers dotted the front yard. It was clear someone cared for this place, despite its age. Taking a deep breath, Corey reached out and pressed the doorbell. The chime echoed inside the house, followed by the slow shuffle of footsteps. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open. An elderly man with thinning white hair and deep-set wrinkles peered out at Corey. His blue eyes, though clouded with age, held a sharp, questioning look. This must be Mr. Abbott, Corey thought. Yes? Mr. Abbott's voice was gruff and cautious. Corey swallowed hard, suddenly feeling nervous. Hello, Mr. Abbott. My name is Corey Williams. I found something that belongs to you. Mr. Abbott's eyebrows furrowed, confusion etched across his face. Corey reached into his pocket and pulled out the worn leather wallet. I found this near the park, Corey explained, his voice growing steadier. I saw your ID inside and thought you'd want it back. Mr. Abbott's eyes widened slightly as he recognized his wallet. His hand, wrinkled and spotted with age, reached out slowly to take it. As their hands briefly touched, Corey noticed how cold Mr. Abbott's fingers felt. Thank you, Mr. Abbott said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. He seemed surprised, as if he couldn't quite believe what was happening. Corey nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. You're welcome, sir. I'm just glad I could return it to you. Mr. Abbott stood there for a moment, clutching the wallet to his chest. His eyes, which had seemed so guarded before, now held a hint of something else. Maybe gratitude, or perhaps just confusion at this unexpected act of kindness. Well, Mr. Abbott said after a pause, his voice still reserved but softer now. That was very honest of you, young man. Corey walked into his family's small apartment, the familiar scent of his mom's cooking filling the air. Despite the warmth of home, he couldn't shake off the lingering image of Mr. Abbott's surprised face. Mom, I'm home, he called out, dropping his backpack by the door. Mrs. Williams poked her head out from the kitchen, her tired eyes lighting up at the sight of her son. Hey, sweetie, how was practice? Corey made his way to the kitchen, drawn by the smell of simmering soup. It was good, he said, leaning against the counter. But something interesting happened on the way home. His mother stirred the pot, raising an eyebrow. Oh, what's that? Corey took a deep breath and launched into the story about finding Mr. Abbott's wallet and returning it. As he spoke, he noticed his mother's expression changing from curiosity to pride. Oh, Corey, she said, putting down her spoon and pulling him into a tight hug. I'm so proud of you. That was the right thing to do. Corey felt a warmth spread through his chest at his mother's words. Thanks, Mom. I just hope it helped Mr. Abbott. Mrs. Williams smiled, but Corey noticed the worry lines creasing her forehead. She turned back to the stove, her shoulders tense. Is everything okay, Mom? Corey asked, sensing her unease. His mother sighed, stirring the soup slowly. We're just having a tough time right now, honey, with your dad losing his job. She trailed off, biting her lip. Corey's heart sank. He knew things had been difficult since his dad lost his job at the factory, but he hadn't realized how much it was weighing on his mom. I'm sorry, Mom, he said softly. Is there anything I can do to help? Mrs. Williams turned to him, her eyes misty. Oh, sweetie, you're already helping more than you know. Just keep being the wonderful, honest boy you are. Corey nodded, feeling a mix of emotions. He was proud of his decision to return the wallet, but he also felt a twinge of guilt. Maybe if he'd kept it, there might have been something inside to help his family. But deep down, he knew he'd made the right choice. As he helped his mom set the table for dinner, Corey couldn't help but wonder about Mr. Abbott and the story behind that old photograph in his wallet. Despite the growing tension at home, he felt a small spark of happiness knowing he'd done something good today. Mr. Abbott sat in his worn armchair, the returned wallet resting on his lap. The house around him was quiet, filled with memories of a life once shared. His gnarled fingers trembled as he opened the wallet, revealing its precious contents. Inside, he found the folded letter from his late wife, Edith. The paper had yellowed with age, but her words remained as vibrant as the day she'd written them. Next to it lay the photograph, Edith's smiling face frozen in time, her eyes twinkling with the love they'd shared for over 5 decades. These items were more than just mementos. They were his lifeline to a happier past. Mr. Abbott's chest tightened as he thought about how close he'd come to losing them forever. If it hadn't been for that young boy's honesty. His mind drifted back to the moment Corey had stood on his doorstep, holding out the wallet. The boy's kindness had caught him off guard, a stark contrast to the cynicism he'd grown accustomed to in recent years. As Mr. Abbott carefully returned the letter and photograph to their rightful place, a sudden urgency gripped him. He reached for the phone on the side table, his fingers shaking as he dialed a number he knew by heart. "Hello, police department," a voice answered on the other end. "Yes, I need to report something," Mr. Abbott said, his voice quavering. Without wasting another moment, he grabbed his coat and headed out the door. The walk to the police station wasn't long, but each step felt heavy with purpose. As he entered the building, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a stark contrast to the dimness of his home. At the front desk, a young officer greeted him. "Can I help you, sir?" Mr. Abbott nodded, his eyes filled with determination. "Yes, I need to speak with someone. It's about a boy who returned my wallet today." The next morning, Corey was jolted awake by the sound of a firm knock at the front door. He rubbed his eyes, still groggy from sleep, as he heard his mother's worried voice in the hallway. "Oh my goodness, officers! Is everything all right?" Mrs. Williams asked, her voice trembling. Corey's heart raced as he scrambled out of bed. What could the police want? Had something terrible happened? He rushed to the living room, where he found his parents standing nervously by the open door, facing 2 uniformed officers. "Good morning, ma'am," one of the officers said politely. "There's no need to worry. We're actually here about your son, Corey." At the mention of his name, Corey stepped forward, his legs feeling wobbly. "That's me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The officer smiled warmly. "Corey, we're here because of your act of kindness yesterday. You returned a wallet to Mr. Harold Abbott. Isn't that right?" Corey nodded, relief washing over him. "Yes, sir. I found it near the park." "Well, young man," the officer continued, "Mr. Abbott was so touched by your honesty that he asked us to help him thank you personally." As if on cue, a familiar figure appeared behind the officers. Mr. Abbott, looking less stern than before, stepped forward with a gentle smile on his weathered face. "Hello, Corey," Mr. Abbott said, his voice softer than Corey remembered. "I hope you don't mind me dropping by like this. I wanted to express my gratitude for what you did." Corey's parents exchanged surprised glances, pride evident in their eyes. Mr. Abbott continued, "I was wondering if you might like to visit me at my home later today. I have something I'd like to share with you, as a thank you for your kindness." Corey looked up at his parents, seeking their approval. Mrs. Williams nodded encouragingly, while Mr. Williams placed a supportive hand on his son's shoulder. "I'd like that, Mr. Abbott," Corey replied, a mix of excitement and nervousness in his voice. As the group finalized the details for Corey's visit, a sense of anticipation filled the air. What could Mr. Abbott have in store for him? Later that afternoon, Corey and his mother walked up the cracked sidewalk to Mr. Abbott's house. Corey's stomach fluttered with nervous excitement as they approached the faded blue door. "Remember your manners," Mrs. Williams whispered, giving Corey's shoulder a gentle squeeze. Corey nodded, taking a deep breath before ringing the doorbell. Within moments, the door swung open, revealing Mr. Abbott. His face, usually stern and guarded, now bore a warm smile. "Welcome, Corey, and you must be Mrs. Williams," Mr. Abbott said, extending his hand. "Please come in." As they stepped inside, Corey couldn't help but notice how tidy the house was, despite its age. Faded photographs lined the walls, and the air smelled faintly of lemon polish. Mr. Abbott led them to a cozy living room, gesturing for them to sit on an old but well-maintained sofa. He settled into an armchair across from them, his eyes twinkling with an emotion Corey couldn't quite place. "Corey," Mr. Abbott began, his voice soft and filled with gratitude. "I can't tell you how much it means to me that you returned my wallet. The letter and photograph inside. They're more precious to me than you could imagine." He paused, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he reached for a small box on the side table. "You see, the letter was the last one my dear wife Edith wrote to me before she passed away. And the photograph? It's my favorite picture of her." Mrs. Williams gasped softly, her eyes brimming with tears. Corey felt a lump form in his throat as he realized the true weight of what he'd done. "I would have been devastated if I'd lost them forever," Mr. Abbott continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Your honesty and kindness. Well, they've touched my heart in a way I haven't felt in years." He opened the small box and pulled out a carefully wrapped package. "I wanted to give you something, Corey. It's not much, but it's a token of my thanks." Corey's eyes widened as he carefully unwrapped the gift. Inside was a beautiful golden pocket watch, its surface gleaming in the soft light of the living room. "This pocket watch belonged to my father," Mr. Abbott explained, his voice filled with nostalgia. "He always said that time was the most precious gift we could give to others. I think he'd be happy knowing it's found its way to someone like you, Corey." Corey held the watch gently, feeling its weight in his hands. He was speechless, overwhelmed by the significance of the gift. "Thank you, Mr. Abbott," Corey finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll treasure it always." Mrs. Williams wiped a tear from her eye, touched by the elderly man's generosity. As Corey examined the intricate details of the watch, Mr. Abbott leaned forward in his chair. "Do you have any interest in history, young man?" Corey's face lit up. "Actually, I love history. It's my favorite subject in school." Mr. Abbott's eyes twinkled with delight. "Is that so? Well, I used to be a history teacher before I became a principal. What period interests you the most?" "I really enjoy learning about World War II," Corey replied eagerly. "We're studying it in class right now." "Ah, a fascinating time," Mr. Abbott nodded. "You know, my father served in the war. He had some incredible stories." As they continued to talk, Corey and Mr. Abbott discovered they shared more than just a love for history. They both enjoyed solving puzzles, had a soft spot for old movies, and even supported the same local baseball team. Mrs. Williams watched with a warm smile as her son and the elderly gentleman chatted animatedly, their initial awkwardness melting away. It was clear that an unexpected friendship was blossoming before her eyes. As Corey and Mr. Abbott continued their conversation, the elderly man's eyes softened with a mixture of sadness and fondness. He gestured to a framed photograph on the mantelpiece, showing a beautiful woman seated at a grand piano. "That's my late wife, Edith," Mr. Abbott said, his voice filled with warmth. "She was an incredible pianist. Her music could fill a room with joy." Corey looked at the photograph, noticing the kind smile on Edith's face. "She looks really nice," he said softly. Mr. Abbott nodded. "She was more than nice, Corey. Edith had a heart of gold, always looking out for others, always ready with a kind word or a helping hand." As he spoke, Mr. Abbott's gaze drifted to the window, looking out at the world beyond. "You know, in my years as a school principal, I saw how much difference a little kindness could make. Edith taught me that. She believed that kindness was like music. It could change the atmosphere of any place, any situation." Corey listened intently, feeling a connection to Mr. Abbott's words. The old man continued, "These days it sometimes feels like the world has forgotten the importance of simple acts of kindness. People are so busy, so disconnected. But then someone like you comes along, Corey, returning a lost wallet, and it reminds me that there's still goodness out there." Mr. Abbott turned back to Corey, his eyes twinkling. "Your act of kindness, it was like hearing one of Edith's beautiful melodies again. It brought light into my day, just as her music used to do." Corey felt a lump in his throat, touched by Mr. Abbott's words. He realized that his simple decision to return the wallet had meant so much more than he could have imagined. As Corey stood to leave, Mr. Abbott placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You're welcome to come back any time, Corey," he said, his eyes crinkling with warmth. "It's been a pleasure talking with you." Corey felt a surge of happiness at the invitation. "Really? That would be great, Mr. Abbott. I'd love to hear more about your wife and your time as a principal." Mr. Abbott nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "I'd enjoy that very much. Perhaps you could come by after school sometime?" "I will," Corey promised, his face beaming with excitement. He turned to his mother, who had been quietly observing their interaction. She smiled and nodded her approval. As they walked down the path from Mr. Abbott's house, Corey felt a new sense of connection. He had entered a stranger's home and left with a friend. The pocket watch in his hand seemed to pulse with the weight of its history and the kindness behind the gift. Mrs. Williams watched her son, noting the spring in his step and the thoughtful expression on his face. She felt a swell of pride at his maturity and compassion. Despite their family's struggles, Corey had chosen to do the right thing, and now this unexpected friendship was blossoming. "You did a wonderful thing, Corey," she said softly as they walked. "Mr. Abbott seems like a very kind man." Corey nodded enthusiastically. "He is, Mom, and he has so many interesting stories. Did you know his wife was a pianist? I can't wait to visit him again." Mrs. Williams smiled, hope stirring in her heart. Perhaps something positive might come from this budding friendship. She couldn't help but think that Corey's act of kindness had opened a door, not just for Mr. Abbott, but for Corey as well. As they turned the corner towards their own home, Corey's mind was already racing with thoughts of his next visit. He had a feeling that there was much more to learn from Mr. Abbott, and he was eager to discover what other stories and wisdom the old man might share. In the days that followed, Corey began visiting Mr. Abbott regularly after school. He would knock on the old wooden door, his backpack slung over one shoulder, and Mr. Abbott would greet him with a warm smile that seemed to erase the wrinkles from his face. "Come in, my boy," Mr. Abbott would say, ushering Corey into the cozy living room. The house, once a symbol of loneliness, now buzzed with the energy of shared stories and laughter. As they sat in comfortable armchairs, Mr. Abbott would regale Corey with tales from his past. His eyes would light up as he spoke about his beloved wife, Edith. "She had the most beautiful hands," Mr. Abbott said one afternoon, his voice soft with memory. "When she played the piano, it was like watching a butterfly dance across the keys." Corey listened intently, picturing the scene in his mind. He could almost hear the delicate notes floating through the air. Mr. Abbott also shared stories from his days as a school principal. "Education is a gift, Corey," he'd say, leaning forward in his chair. "It opens doors you never knew existed." These words resonated deeply with Corey, who dreamed of becoming a teacher himself one day. He soaked up Mr. Abbott's wisdom like a sponge, asking questions and sharing his own hopes for the future. As the weeks passed, their bond grew stronger. Corey found comfort in these afternoon conversations, a respite from the worries at home. Mr. Abbott's stories provided a window into a different world, one filled with love, learning, and the power of kindness. For Mr. Abbott, Corey's visits brought new life to his quiet home. The boy's eagerness to learn and his compassionate nature reminded him of why he had loved being an educator. In Corey's company, the weight of loneliness that had settled on his shoulders began to lift. As the days grew shorter and autumn leaves began to fall, Corey's home life took a turn for the worse. Mr. Williams, his father, had been out of work for months now, and the strain was showing on everyone's faces. Bills piled up on the kitchen table, their red past due stamps a constant reminder of their dire situation. One evening, Corey overheard his parents talking in hushed, worried tones. "I don't know how we're going to make next month's mortgage payment," his mother whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I'm trying, honey, I really am," Mr. Williams replied, sounding defeated. "But no one's hiring." Corey's heart sank. He knew things were bad, but the thought of losing their home made his stomach churn. The next morning, the atmosphere at breakfast was tense. His parents tried to put on brave faces, but Corey could see the worry lines etched deep on their foreheads. Despite the growing tension at home, Corey found solace in his visits with Mr. Abbott. The old man's house became a sanctuary, a place where the weight of his family's troubles seemed to lift from his young shoulders. On a particularly rough day when the electricity had been shut off at home, Corey trudged to Mr. Abbott's house, his spirits low. As soon as he stepped inside, the warm glow of the lamps and Mr. Abbott's gentle smile worked their magic. "What's troubling you, my boy?" Mr. Abbott asked, noticing Corey's downcast eyes. Corey hesitated, then spilled out the whole story. His dad's job loss, the mounting bills, the threat of losing their home. As he talked, tears he'd been holding back for weeks finally fell. Mr. Abbott listened patiently, his weathered hand resting on Corey's shoulder. When Corey finished, the old man's eyes were misty with compassion. "Life can be mighty tough sometimes," Mr. Abbott said softly. "But remember, Corey, tough times don't last. Tough people do. And you, my young friend, are tougher than you know." As Corey settled into the worn armchair in Mr. Abbott's living room, the old man studied him with kind eyes. "How are things at home, Corey?" he asked gently. Corey's shoulders slumped, and he looked down at his hands. For a moment, he considered brushing off the question with a casual, "Fine." But something about Mr. Abbott's genuine concern made him pause. Taking a deep breath, Corey began to speak. Things aren't so good, Mr. Abbott," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Abbott leaned forward, his eyes filled with compassion. "What's troubling you, my boy?" Corey's words came out in a rush. "Dad lost his job a few months ago. He's been trying real hard to find work, but nothing's come up yet. Mom's working extra shifts at the diner, but it's not enough." He swallowed hard, fighting back tears. "I heard them talking last night. We might lose our house if things don't get better soon." As Corey spoke, Mr. Abbott listened quietly, his weathered face etched with concern. He didn't interrupt, allowing the boy to pour out his worries. "I wish I could help more," Corey continued, his voice cracking. "I've been doing odd jobs around the neighborhood, mowing lawns and stuff, but it's not much. I just feel so helpless." Mr. Abbott nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Corey's face. The boy's honesty and the weight of his family's struggles touched the old man deeply. He saw in Corey's eyes a mixture of fear, determination, and a maturity beyond his years. "That's a heavy burden for young shoulders," Mr. Abbott said softly, his voice filled with understanding. "Thank you for trusting me with this, Corey. It takes courage to open up about such difficult times." Corey looked up, meeting Mr. Abbott's gaze. The kindness he saw there made him feel a little less alone. For a moment, they sat in companionable silence, the ticking of the old clock on the mantel, the only sound in the room. Mr. Abbott leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant as he watched Corey. The boy's words echoed in his mind, stirring memories long buried. He saw in Corey a reflection of his younger self, determined, kind-hearted, and facing challenges beyond his years. As he studied the boy's worried face, Mr. Abbott felt a familiar ache in his chest. It was the same feeling he'd had when he first lost Edith, his beloved wife. But now, something else stirred within him, a warmth he hadn't felt in years. "You know, Corey," Mr. Abbott began softly, "you remind me a lot of myself when I was your age." Corey looked up, his eyes curious. "Really?" Mr. Abbott nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Oh yes, I faced some tough times too. But do you know what got me through?" Corey shook his head, listening intently. "People who cared," Mr. Abbott said, his voice filled with emotion. "People who saw something in me and decided to help." As he spoke, Mr. Abbott realized how much his friendship with Corey had changed him. The loneliness that had consumed him since Edith's passing had begun to lift. In its place, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. "Corey," Mr. Abbott said, his voice growing stronger, "I want you to know that you're not alone in this. Your family's struggles, well, they matter to me too." Corey's eyes widened, a glimmer of hope shining through his worry. Mr. Abbott leaned forward, his mind racing with possibilities. He had resources, connections from his years as a school principal. Maybe, just maybe, he could make a difference for this boy and his family. "I think," Mr. Abbott said slowly, "it's time I did something to help." The next morning, Mr. Abbott woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. He dressed carefully, choosing his best sweater and polishing his old leather shoes. With a determined gleam in his eye, he set out to find a way to help Corey and his family. Mr. Abbott's first stop was Oak Ridge Academy, a well-respected school in the area. As he walked through the polished hallways, memories of his days as a principal flooded back. The smell of chalk and books brought a smile to his face. At the front office, he approached the receptionist. "Good morning," he said politely. "I'd like to inquire about enrollment requirements, please." The receptionist, a kind-faced woman, smiled and handed him a packet. "Here's all the information you'll need, sir. Are you looking to enroll a student?" Mr. Abbott nodded, thinking of Corey. Yes, a very bright young man. As he pored over the packet, Mr. Abbott felt a surge of hope. The school offered scholarships for talented students from low-income families. He made a mental note to ask Corey about his grades and interests. Next, he visited Westfield High, another reputable school in the district. Again, he collected information on enrollment and financial aid options. The guidance counselor there was particularly helpful, explaining various programs available for students in need. By lunchtime, Mr. Abbott had visited 3 schools and gathered a wealth of information. He sat on a park bench, carefully organizing the papers in his folder. As he read through the requirements, good grades, extracurricular activities, letters of recommendation, he felt increasingly optimistic. This could work, he murmured to himself, his heart swelling with hope. He thought of Corey's bright eyes and eager mind, imagining the boy thriving in one of these schools. As the afternoon sun warmed his face, Mr. Abbott felt happier than he had in years. He had a plan now, a way to make a real difference in Corey's life. It wouldn't solve all the family's problems, but it was a start, a chance for a better future. Meanwhile, at the Williams household, the atmosphere grew heavier with each passing day. Mr. Williams trudged through the front door, his shoulders slumped and his eyes downcast. Corey, who had been anxiously waiting by the window, felt his heart sink at the sight of his father's defeated expression. "How did it go, Dad?" Corey asked softly, already knowing the answer. Mr. Williams shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not good, son. They went with someone else." Corey watched as his father collapsed onto the worn couch, burying his face in his hands. The weight of their financial troubles seemed to press down on the entire family, filling the air with an almost tangible sense of despair. Mrs. Williams emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She took one look at her husband and sighed, her own eyes filling with unshed tears. "We'll figure something out," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We always do." Corey felt a lump form in his throat. He wanted so badly to help, to do something, anything, to ease his parents' burden. But what could a 13-year-old boy do in the face of such overwhelming odds? As the days wore on, Corey found himself clinging to his visits with Mr. Abbott like a lifeline. The old man's house became a sanctuary, a place where the worries of the world seemed to fade away, if only for a little while. "You seem troubled today, my boy," Mr. Abbott observed one afternoon as Corey sat quietly staring out the window. Corey hesitated, then slowly began to open up about his family's struggles. Mr. Abbott listened attentively, his kind eyes filled with understanding and compassion. "It's just, I feel so helpless," Corey admitted, his voice cracking. "I wish there was something I could do." Mr. Abbott leaned forward, placing a gentle hand on Corey's shoulder. "Sometimes, Corey, the most important thing we can do is to keep hope alive. Your optimism, your kindness, these things matter more than you know." Corey looked up, meeting Mr. Abbott's gaze. In those wise, weathered eyes, he saw a glimmer of something he desperately needed: hope. And for the first time in weeks, Corey felt a small spark of optimism ignite in his heart. The next day, a gentle knock echoed through the Williams' modest home. Corey, who had been helping his mother in the kitchen, rushed to answer the door. His eyes widened in surprise when he saw Mr. Abbott standing on their porch, a large gift basket cradled in his arms. "Mr. Abbott," Corey exclaimed, a smile lighting up his face. "What are you doing here?" The elderly man's eyes twinkled with warmth. "I thought I'd pay a visit to your family, Corey. May I come in?" Corey nodded eagerly, stepping aside to let Mr. Abbott enter. Mrs. Williams appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyebrows raised in surprise at the unexpected visitor. "Mom, this is Mr. Abbott," Corey introduced, his voice brimming with excitement. Mr. Abbott extended his hand, offering a gentle smile. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Williams. I hope you don't mind my unexpected visit." Mrs. Williams shook his hand, her initial surprise melting into a welcoming smile. "Not at all, Mr. Abbott. We've heard so much about you from Corey." Just then, Mr. Williams emerged from the living room, curiosity etched on his tired face. Mr. Abbott turned to greet him, his eyes filled with understanding and compassion. "I've brought a little something for your family," Mr. Abbott said, presenting the gift basket. It was overflowing with fresh fruits, vegetables, canned goods, and other household necessities. Mrs. Williams gasped softly, her eyes widening at the generous offering. "Oh, Mr. Abbott, you shouldn't have." Mr. Williams stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. This is very kind of you, sir." Mr. Abbott waved off their thanks with a gentle hand. "It's the least I could do. Corey has been such a wonderful friend to me. I wanted to show my appreciation to his family as well." As they gathered in the living room, the atmosphere began to shift. The weight of worry that had hung over the Williams family seemed to lift slightly. They talked and laughed, sharing stories and finding comfort in each other's company. Corey watched with joy as his parents visibly relaxed, their smiles becoming more genuine as they conversed with Mr. Abbott. He could see a new light in their eyes, a glimmer of hope that had been missing for so long. As the evening wore on, Mrs. Williams invited Mr. Abbott to stay for dinner. The small family and their guest gathered around the modest dining table, sharing a simple but hearty meal. The conversation flowed easily, filled with warmth and laughter that had been scarce in the Williams household lately. After dinner, while Mrs. Williams cleared the table and Mr. Williams excused himself to make a phone call, Corey and Mr. Abbott found themselves alone in the living room. The soft glow of the lamp cast a comforting light over them as they settled into their seats. Mr. Abbott leaned forward, his eyes twinkling with curiosity. "So, Corey, tell me more about your dreams. What do you want to be when you grow up?" Corey's face lit up, his eyes shining with enthusiasm. He took a deep breath, as if gathering courage, and said, "Well, Mr. Abbott, I've been thinking about it a lot lately. I want to be a teacher just like you were." Mr. Abbott's eyebrows rose in surprise, a smile spreading across his weathered face. "Is that so?" he asked, his voice filled with warmth. Corey nodded eagerly. "Yes, sir. I've always loved learning, and I want to help others learn too. I remember how you told me about your days as a principal, how you could make a difference in so many lives. I want to do that too." Mr. Abbott felt a swell of emotion in his chest. He reached out and patted Corey's hand gently. "That's a wonderful ambition, Corey. Teaching is a noble profession, one that requires dedication and a big heart. And you, my boy, have both in spades." Corey's cheeks flushed with pride at Mr. Abbott's words. "I know it won't be easy," he continued, his voice growing softer, "especially with how things are at home right now. But I'm going to work hard and do my best to make it happen." Mr. Abbott felt a surge of admiration for the young boy sitting before him. Despite the hardships his family was facing, Corey's spirit remained unbroken, his dreams undimmed. It reminded Mr. Abbott of his own youth, of the challenges he had faced and overcome. "You know, Corey," Mr. Abbott said, his voice filled with emotion, "I have no doubt that you'll make an excellent teacher someday. Your determination and your kindness will take you far." Mr. Abbott cleared his throat, his eyes twinkling with purpose. "Mr. and Mrs. Williams, there's something I'd like to discuss with you," he said, his voice gentle but firm. Corey's parents looked up, curiosity etched on their tear-red faces. Mr. Abbott continued, "I've been thinking about Corey's future, and I believe I can help. Nah. He explained about the scholarship fund he had worked on with his previous schools. I'd like to provide Corey with a scholarship, Mr. Abbott said, his voice filled with warmth. It would cover his education expenses through high school and even college if he chooses to pursue that path. The room fell silent. Corey's eyes widened in disbelief, while his parents exchanged stunned glances. Mrs. Williams was the first to speak, her voice trembling. Mr. Abbott, that's incredibly generous, but we couldn't possibly accept such a gift. Mr. Williams nodded in agreement, his pride warring with the hope in his eyes. It's too much, sir. We appreciate the thought, but... Mr. Abbott held up a hand, silencing their protests. Please, he said softly. This isn't charity. It's an investment in a bright young mind. Corey has shown me kindness and companionship when I needed it most. Let me do this for him, for all of you. Corey looked at his parents, his eyes pleading. Mom, Dad, please. This could change everything. Mrs. Williams's eyes welled with tears. She reached out and squeezed her husband's hand. Mr. Williams took a deep breath, his shoulders relaxing as he made his decision. Mr. Abbott, he said, his voice thick with emotion, we don't know how to thank you. It's a wonderful gift. If you're sure, then we accept, with all our hearts. Mr. Abbott's eyes sparkled with excitement as he sat down with Corey and his parents in their modest living room. The old man's hands trembled slightly as he reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out an official-looking envelope. Corey, Mr. Abbott began, his voice warm and full of pride. I have some news for you, son. Corey leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. His parents exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to expect. Mr. Abbott handed the envelope to Corey. Go ahead, open it, he encouraged gently. With shaking hands, Corey carefully opened the envelope and pulled out a letter. As his eyes scanned the page, they grew wider and wider. His mouth fell open in disbelief. I don't understand, Corey stammered, looking up at Mr. Abbott with tears in his eyes. Mr. Abbott smiled, placing a comforting hand on Corey's shoulder. It's a full scholarship, my boy, to Westfield Academy, one of the best schools in the state. Mrs. Williams gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Mr. Williams leaned forward, his brow furrowed in confusion. But how? Mr. Williams asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Abbott explained how he had reached out to his old contacts and advocated for Corey. This young man has a bright future ahead of him, he said, his voice filled with emotion. He deserves every opportunity to shine. Corey sat in stunned silence, the letter clutched tightly in his hands. Tears streamed down his face as the reality of what this meant began to sink in. Mr. Abbott, Corey choked out. I don't know what to say. Thank you so much. Mrs. Williams burst into tears, overcome with joy and relief. Mr. Williams, usually so stoic, wiped at his eyes, a smile breaking through his tough exterior. This is incredible, Mr. Williams said, his voice thick with emotion. We can never repay you for this kindness, Mr. Abbott. Mr. Abbott shook his head, his eyes twinkling. Seeing Corey succeed will be all the payment I need. As the news settled in, a palpable sense of hope filled the room. For the first time in months, the Williams family felt a weight lift from their shoulders. They looked at each other with renewed optimism, the dark cloud that had been hanging over them beginning to dissipate. Corey jumped up and threw his arms around Mr. Abbott, hugging him tightly. I promise I'll make you proud, he whispered fiercely. Mr. Abbott patted Corey's back, his eyes misty. You already have, my boy. You already have. As summer faded into autumn, Corey found himself standing at the gates of Westfield Academy, his new school uniform crisp and his backpack heavy with books. His heart raced with a mixture of excitement and nervousness as he took his first steps onto the campus. The first few days were overwhelming. The sprawling grounds, state-of-the-art facilities, and rigorous curriculum were a far cry from his old school. Corey felt out of place among his new classmates, many of whom came from wealthy families. He struggled to keep up with the fast-paced lessons, and often found himself staying up late to complete his homework. But Corey was determined to make the most of this opportunity. He remembered Mr. Abbott's faith in him and used it as motivation to push through the challenges. Slowly but surely, he began to find his rhythm. Every evening, Corey would call Mr. Abbott to share his experiences. The old man listened patiently, offering words of encouragement and advice. "Remember, Corey," Mr. Abbott would say, his voice warm and reassuring. "You earned your place there. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." With Mr. Abbott's guidance, Corey learned to manage his time better and developed effective study habits. He joined the school's debate club, discovering a talent for public speaking that surprised even himself. His teachers began to take notice of his hard work and dedication. As the weeks passed, Corey's confidence grew. He made new friends who appreciated his kind heart and down-to-earth nature. His grades improved steadily, and he even earned a spot on the honor roll for the first quarter. One crisp Saturday afternoon, Mr. Abbott visited Corey at school to watch him participate in a debate competition. As Corey eloquently presented his arguments, Mr. Abbott beamed with pride from the audience. After the event, they walked together through the school grounds, talking animatedly about Corey's progress. "You've come so far, my boy," Mr. Abbott said, his eyes twinkling. "I knew you had it in you." Corey smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mr. Abbott. Your support means everything to me." As they continued their walk, Corey realized that his initial struggles had transformed into valuable lessons. With Mr. Abbott's unwavering support and his own determination, he was not just surviving at Westfield Academy, he was thriving. As autumn turned to winter, Corey's hard work at Westfield Academy continued to pay off. His grades remained strong, and he found himself excelling in subjects he once struggled with. His teachers praised his dedication, and his classmates looked up to him as a role model. Meanwhile, back at home, things were finally starting to look up for the Williams family. After months of searching and countless interviews, Mr. Williams landed a stable job at a local manufacturing company. The position offered good pay and benefits, providing the family with much-needed financial security. With Mr. Williams's new income, the family breathed a collective sigh of relief. They were no longer in danger of losing their home, and the constant worry that had hung over them for so long began to lift. Mrs. Williams was able to pay off overdue bills, and for the first time in months, she didn't have to choose between buying groceries or paying the electricity bill. One evening, as the family sat down for dinner, Mrs. Williams looked at Corey with tears in her eyes. "You know, Corey," she said, her voice filled with emotion, "I can't help but think about how all of this started with you finding that wallet." Corey blushed, not used to being the center of attention. "I just did what anyone would do," he mumbled. "But that's just it," his mother continued. "Not everyone would have done what you did. Your honesty and kindness led us to Mr. Abbott, and look at how much our lives have changed because of it." Mr. Williams nodded in agreement. "Your mother's right, son. If you hadn't returned that wallet, we might not be sitting here like this today. Your integrity set off a chain of events that helped turn our lives around." Corey felt a warmth spread through his chest as he looked at his parents' proud faces. He thought about Mr. Abbott and how their friendship had grown, about his new school and the opportunities it offered, and about his family's renewed hope for the future. As winter deepened, Mr. Abbott's health began to decline. Corey noticed his friend moving slower, coughing more often, and seeming more tired than usual. Worry settled in Corey's heart, and he found himself visiting Mr. Abbott's house more frequently, eager to check on the elderly man who had become such an important part of his life. One chilly afternoon, Corey knocked on Mr. Abbott's door, his backpack slung over his shoulder. Mr. Abbott answered, his smile warm but weary. "Corey, my boy," he said, his voice slightly hoarse. "Come in, come in." Corey stepped inside, immediately noticing the extra blankets draped over Mr. Abbott's favorite armchair. "How are you feeling today, Mr. Abbott?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. Mr. Abbott settled into his chair with a soft groan. "Oh, just a bit under the weather. Nothing to worry about." He waved his hand dismissively, but Corey wasn't convinced. Despite his ill health, Mr. Abbott's eyes lit up as he asked, "How's school going? Tell me about your latest history project." As Corey shared stories about his classes, Mr. Abbott listened intently, offering words of encouragement and sage advice. Even in his weakened state, he never failed to support Corey's academic pursuits. Mrs. Williams began visiting Mr. Abbott regularly as well, helping him with his medication and running errands. She'd bring over homemade soup and make sure his house was tidy. Corey often found her there when he arrived after school, her presence a comfort to both Mr. Abbott and himself. One day, as Corey sat beside Mr. Abbott's chair, the old man's eyes grew distant. "You know, Corey," he said softly, "your visits remind me so much of when Edith and I first met. We were young, full of dreams, just like you." Corey leaned in, eager to hear another story from Mr. Abbott's past. As the elderly man spoke of his late wife and their early days together, Corey could see the spark of joy in his eyes, momentarily chasing away the weariness of illness. One crisp morning, as Corey arrived at Mr. Abbott's house, he found the elderly man sitting in his armchair with an unusually excited expression. Mr. Abbott's eyes twinkled with a mixture of joy and nostalgia as he beckoned Corey to come closer. "Corey, my boy," Mr. Abbott said, his voice filled with warmth, "I have something very special I'd like to give you." Corey's eyebrows raised in surprise. "Mr. Abbott, you've already done so much for me. You don't need to—" Mr. Abbott held up a hand, silencing Corey's protests. "This isn't just any gift, Corey. It's something that meant the world to my dear Edith." With a gentle nod, Mr. Abbott gestured towards the living room. There, gleaming in the soft sunlight streaming through the window, stood a beautiful, upright piano. Corey's eyes widened as he took in the sight of the instrument, its polished wood reflecting years of care and love. "This was Edith's piano," Mr. Abbott explained, his voice thick with emotion. "She loved music more than anything in the world, except perhaps teaching. She always dreamed of passing it on to someone who valued music and learning as much as she did." Corey stood speechless, his hand resting on the smooth surface of the piano. He could almost feel the history and love embedded in its keys. Mr. Abbott continued, his eyes misting over. "I've seen how hard you work at school, how much you care about learning and helping others. You remind me so much of Edith in that way. I know she would have wanted you to have this." Overwhelmed by the gesture, Corey felt tears welling up in his own eyes. "Mr. Abbott, I don't know what to say. This is incredible." The old man smiled, reaching out to pat Corey's arm. "You don't have to say anything, my boy. Just promise me you'll take good care of it and let it inspire you the way it inspired Edith." Corey nodded emphatically, his voice filled with determination and gratitude. "I promise, Mr. Abbott. I'll treasure it always and practice every day. Thank you so much." One crisp evening, the Williams family bustled around their modest kitchen, preparing for a special dinner. The aroma of roasting chicken and fresh-baked rolls filled the air as Mrs. Williams put the finishing touches on the meal. Corey set the table with care, making sure everything was perfect for their honored guest. As the doorbell chimed, Corey rushed to answer it. There stood Mr. Abbott, looking dapper in a neat sweater vest, his eyes twinkling with warmth. "Welcome, Mr. Abbott," Corey beamed, ushering him inside. The family gathered around the dinner table, the atmosphere filled with joy and gratitude. Mr. Williams, now employed and looking more relaxed than he had in months, raised his glass in a toast. "To Mr. Abbott," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "and to the incredible chain of events that brought us all together." As they enjoyed their meal, the conversation flowed easily. They reminisced about the day Corey found Mr. Abbott's wallet, marveling at how such a simple act of kindness had changed all their lives so profoundly. "I never imagined that returning a lost wallet would lead to all this," Corey said, gesturing around the table. Mr. Abbott smiled warmly. "It just goes to show, my boy, that even the smallest acts of kindness can have far-reaching effects." Mrs. Williams nodded in agreement. "We've been blessed beyond measure. Corey's education, our financial situation improving, and most importantly, gaining you as part of our family, Mr. Abbott." The old man's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever, a family. I can't thank you enough for welcoming me into your lives." Corey reached out and squeezed Mr. Abbott's hand. "We're the ones who should be thanking you. You've changed our lives in so many ways." As they continued their meal, sharing stories and laughter, it was clear that the bonds between them had grown deep and strong. Mr. Abbott was no longer just a neighbor or a benefactor. He had truly become a cherished member of their family. As the seasons changed, Corey's bond with Mr. Abbott only grew stronger. The elderly man became a regular fixture in the Williams household, his visits eagerly anticipated by the entire family. Despite his declining health, Mr. Abbott found immense joy and comfort in their companionship. On sunny afternoons, Corey and Mr. Abbott could often be found sitting on the front porch, engaged in lively conversations about history, literature, and life. Mr. Abbott's eyes would light up as he shared stories from his days as a school principal, and Corey listened with rapt attention, soaking up every bit of wisdom. "You know, Corey," Mr. Abbott said one day, his voice a bit weaker but still filled with warmth, "watching you grow and learn reminds me why I loved being an educator. You have such a bright future ahead of you." Corey beamed at the compliment, feeling a surge of determination to make his mentor proud. "It's all thanks to you, Mr. Abbott. Your support has meant everything to me and my family." Mrs. Williams often joined them, bringing out glasses of fresh lemonade and homemade cookies. She marveled at the positive influence Mr. Abbott had on her son, noticing how Corey's confidence and maturity had blossomed under the old man's guidance. Even Mr. Williams, once so burdened by financial worries, found solace in Mr. Abbott's company. The two men bonded over their shared love of baseball, spending many evenings discussing past World Series and debating the merits of various players. As Mr. Abbott's health continued to decline, his visits became shorter, but no less meaningful. The Williams family rallied around him, offering support and care. They accompanied him to doctor's appointments, helped with his groceries, and ensured his home remained comfortable and well-maintained. Despite his physical limitations, Mr. Abbott's spirit remained strong. He never missed an opportunity to attend Corey's school events or celebrate family milestones. His presence at these gatherings brought an extra layer of joy and wisdom that everyone cherished. The Williams family embraced Mr. Abbott as if he were their own beloved grandfather. His presence filled a void they hadn't even realized existed, bringing a sense of completeness to their home. Every week, without fail, they gathered for a special family dinner that became a cherished tradition. These dinners were more than just meals. They were a celebration of love, friendship, and the unexpected blessings life can bring. Mrs. Williams would spend hours in the kitchen, preparing Mr. Abbott's favorite dishes alongside new recipes she wanted to try. The aroma of home-cooked food would fill the house, drawing everyone to the dining room with eager anticipation. As they sat around the table, laughter and warmth filled the air. Mr. Williams would regale them with funny stories from his new job, while Corey excitedly shared his latest academic achievements. Mr. Abbott listened intently, his eyes twinkling with pride and joy. "You know," Mr. Abbott would often say, raising his glass in a toast, "family isn't always about blood. It's about the people who want you in their life and accept you for who you are. I'm grateful every day that you've welcomed me into yours." These words never failed to bring tears to Mrs. Williams' eyes and a lump to Mr. Williams' throat. Corey would reach out and squeeze Mr. Abbott's hand, a gesture that spoke volumes about their bond. As the seasons changed, so did Corey. Under Mr. Abbott's gentle guidance and the unwavering support of his parents, Corey's education continued to flourish. His grades improved steadily, and his passion for learning grew stronger with each passing day. He began to tutor younger students at school, channeling Mr. Abbott's teaching spirit and discovering his own talent for inspiring others. The family dinners became a place where Corey could share his academic triumphs and seek advice on challenges. Mr. Abbott was always ready with words of encouragement and practical tips, drawing from his years of experience in education. "Remember, Corey," he'd say, his voice filled with warmth, "education is not just about grades. It's about growing as a person and learning to see the world in new ways." These gatherings were more than just about food and conversation. They were a testament to the power of kindness, the strength of chosen family, and the beautiful ways in which lives can intertwine. Each meal reinforced the sense of belonging they all felt, creating memories that would last a lifetime. As the laughter from their weekly family dinner faded, Corey helped his mother clear the table. The warm glow of contentment lingered in the air, a feeling that had become wonderfully familiar since Mr. Abbott had entered their lives. Corey glanced over at the elderly man, who was engaged in animated conversation with Mr. Williams about the latest baseball game. Suddenly, a wave of emotion washed over Corey. He paused, dish in hand, as the realization hit him. Mr. Abbott had become so much more than just a neighbor or a friend. He was family. Mrs. Williams noticed her son's thoughtful expression. "Everything okay, sweetie?" she asked softly. Corey nodded, smiling. "Yeah, Mom. I was just thinking about how lucky we are to have Mr. Abbott in our lives." Mrs. Williams squeezed his shoulder. "Why don't you go sit with him for a bit? Your dad and I can finish up here." Grateful for the suggestion, Corey made his way to the living room where Mr. Abbott was now seated in his favorite armchair. The old man's face lit up as Corey approached. "There's my boy," Mr. Abbott said warmly. "Come sit with me for a moment." Corey settled onto the ottoman at Mr. Abbott's feet, just as he had done countless times before. The familiar scent of Old Spice aftershave enveloped him, bringing a sense of comfort and security. Mr. Abbott leaned forward, his eyes twinkling. "You know, Corey, I've been thinking a lot lately about how proud I am of the young man you're becoming. Your kindness, your dedication to your studies, the way you help others. It's truly remarkable." Corey felt a lump form in his throat. "Thank you, Mr. Abbott. That means so much coming from you." The old man's voice softened. "But more than that, I want you to know how much you've enriched my life. Before you came along, I was just a lonely old man, stuck in my memories. But you, Corey, you brought light back into my world. You've given me a reason to look forward to each day." Tears pricked at Corey's eyes. He reached out and took Mr. Abbott's weathered hand in his own. "You've changed my life too, Mr. Abbott. I don't know where I'd be without your guidance and support. You're like the grandfather I never had." As the seasons changed, Corey made sure to visit Mr. Abbott every day after school, often bringing his homework to complete in the cozy living room of the old man's house. Mrs. Williams would drop by with homemade meals, ensuring Mr. Abbott was eating well. Even Mr. Williams, despite his busy work schedule, found time to mow Mr. Abbott's lawn and tend to small repairs around the house. The bond between them had grown unbreakable. They celebrated holidays together, filling Mr. Abbott's once quiet home with laughter and warmth. On Thanksgiving, they gathered around a table groaning with Mrs. Williams's delicious cooking, Mr. Abbott seated at the head like a beloved patriarch. For Christmas, the Williams family insisted on decorating Mr. Abbott's house. Corey and his father strung twinkling lights along the eaves while Mrs. Williams and Mr. Abbott supervised from the porch, sipping hot cocoa. The joy in Mr. Abbott's eyes as he watched the house transform was a gift in itself. Birthdays became grand affairs, with Mr. Abbott's 80th being a particularly special celebration. The Williams family organized a surprise party, inviting old colleagues and friends from Mr. Abbott's days as a school principal. Tears of happiness glistened in the old man's eyes as he blew out the candles on his cake, surrounded by people who loved him. Milestones were shared and cherished together. When Corey received his first academic award at his new school, Mr. Abbott was there in the audience, beaming with pride. And when Mr. Williams finally secured a promotion at work, Mr. Abbott raised the first toast at their celebratory dinner. Through each passing day, they created lasting memories of love and friendship. The piano Mr. Abbott had gifted to Corey became a centerpiece of their gatherings, with Corey learning to play simple tunes that brought a wistful smile to Mr. Abbott's face as he remembered his late wife. As the golden light of the setting sun filtered through the curtains of the Williams' cozy dining room, laughter and the clinking of cutlery filled the air. Corey, his parents, and Mr. Abbott sat around the table sharing a warm, home-cooked meal. The aroma of Mrs. Williams's famous pot roast wafted through the air, mingling with the scent of freshly baked rolls. Mr. Abbott, seated at the head of the table, looked around with a contented smile on his weathered face. His eyes, once dulled by loneliness, now sparkled with joy as he watched the family that had become his own. He chuckled at one of Mr. Williams's jokes, his laughter joining the chorus of voices that made the house feel so alive. Corey, sitting next to Mr. Abbott, couldn't help but beam with happiness. He looked from his parents to Mr. Abbott, marveling at how their lives had intertwined in such a beautiful way. The boy reached for another roll, playfully nudging Mr. Abbott's arm as he did so. "Hey, save some for the rest of us, young man," Mr. Abbott teased, his eyes twinkling with mirth. Mrs. Williams watched the exchange with a warm smile, her heart full of gratitude for the family they had become. She caught her husband's eye across the table, and they shared a knowing look, both silently acknowledging how much their lives had changed for the better. As Mr. Williams regaled them with a funny story from work, Mr. Abbott leaned back in his chair, taking in the scene before him. The warmth of the room, the delicious food, and most importantly, the love that surrounded him filled his heart to bursting. He realized with a sense of profound gratitude that he was no longer alone. This family, brought together by a simple act of kindness, had become his anchor, his joy, and his home. The laughter continued to echo through the house, a testament to how kindness, compassion, and love can create a family out of strangers. Mr. Abbott's smile widened, his eyes glistening with unshed tears of happiness. In this moment, surrounded by the Williams family, he knew he had found where he truly belonged. If you enjoyed the story of Mr. Abbott and Corey, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it,